Hello, good evening and welcome. This is BizFirst Review 360, your weekly roundup of the top business news and developments impacting the economy. This week in Sri Lanka has been somewhat of a roller coaster ride. On Monday, we saw the tabling of the Appropriations Bill 2018. The first reading of the Appropriations Bill marks the beginning of the budget process in Parliament. The second reading, also known as the budget speech, will happen on the 9th of November. The deficit for 2018 has been estimated at more than 1,000 billion rupees. How will the state cover this deficit? By going into debt, of course. Where will those loans come from? We'll find out in due course. Meanwhile, this week, we also saw Cabinet finally giving the nod of approval for the draft of the National Audit Bill after it was deferred on 24 previous occasions since it was first brought to the attention of the Cabinet in April 2015. Also this week, we saw State Minister of Finance Sri Lanka making some stern remarks regarding the controversy surrounding the purchase of 4 Airbus A350 carriers for Sri Lankan Airlines. Finance Minister Mangala Samaravira is in Washington for negotiations with the IMF. And to cap it all off, towards the latter part of this week, we saw the strike by unions of Sri Lanka Railways, which stranded thousands of commuters. With all this and more, here's a look at the top stories this week.
Addressing the launch of the flagship State of the Economy 2017 and Tax Policy in Sri Lanka report at the Institute of Policy Studies, Minister Harsha De Silva commented on the delays in reforms.
And people, when they ask me, you've been slow on reform, I say to them, well, reform is not only economic reform. We have to do other types of reform as well to extricate the country from the difficult position it was. We have to do political reform. We have to do foreign policy reform. Some have forgotten that if we were going down that same path, probably by today, we would have had economic sanctions placed against us. We would have been hauled up to the International Criminal Court and be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. For a government, we needed to deal with those urgent issues at that time. The government of Sri Lanka engaged in reform in the politics, reform in our diplomatic engagements with the world. Yes, economic reform is essential. Economic reform must be done. But political reform, giving people the rights that they deserve in a democracy, is perhaps equally or even more important, I would argue. And then extricating ourselves as a sovereign nation with the global community, whether it is in the UN in New York or in Geneva, is important to a government. As a nation, it is important.
State Minister of Finance Eran Wickramaratne told the Advocata Economic Freedom Summit that Airbus is also responsible for the controversy surrounding the sale and the termination of 4 A350s to Sri Lanka.
Clearly there is a problem on Sri Lankan Airlines. I would like to ask the question, what should we do with it? What should we do with it? It doesn't matter who is in charge. It doesn't matter what the management team is. Fundamentally, is there a proposition for Sri Lankan Airlines? My own personal view is there isn't an economic and financial proposition. We need to be honest with ourselves. We need to then ask the question, how much are we willing to pay if it brings some kind of national pride to fly the flag in the air? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves. That's a political question. That's not an economic and financial question. A political question needs a political answer. And sometimes we have to make political decisions. Sri Lankan Airlines was sold 8 A350-900 aircrafts, long-flying, broad-bodied aircrafts, which didn't fit its strategy. I think the sellers also have a responsibility. Airbus Industries in France also has a responsibility. They should have taken note whether a small country like ours, with a small GDP, a small airline, competing internationally, should have actually been sold these aircrafts. Sellers and buyers both have responsibilities in an economy, and that is unfortunate that we have had to already pay nearly $100 million in basically terminating 4 aircrafts, still 4 aircrafts on our books today.
Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Anushka Vijayasinghe, commented on the opportunity cost of funding loss-making state-owned enterprises.
A few years ago, I remember publishing a short blog post about SOEs where I made a small attempt to make them relatable. I put forward around 9 alarming facts about SOE losses. This was around 2014. The 2 that got the most attention were relating to the 2 airlines at the time, 2014. 1. The projected losses of the 2 state-owned airlines in the next 3 years will be 10 times what Sri Lanka spends each year on education-related welfare like textbooks, uniforms and school meals. This is from the Ministry of Finance report back in 2014. The second one that got a lot of, that animated people. The losses of Mihin Lanka Private Limited in 2013 is equal to the entire amount the government spent in that year on crucial welfare programs like Triposha, Poshanamalla and fresh milk for preschool children. Mihin had just 3 aircraft. These programs served over 1 million people. Suddenly you take this from an economic reform debate or an SOE reform debate, a public finance debate, fiscal prudence debate, into a debate around value for money and spending priorities for people. I think if we are to succeed in holding the public sector accountable for the money collected from current and future taxpayers, we need to get better at creating a more interesting narrative that gets more people animated.
Highlighting concerns of increasing inflation, the Institute of Policy Studies set out challenges facing the central bank in setting monetary policy in a low-growth and rising inflation environment.
The main problem now is that there is rising inflation. Inflation has been rising steadily to about 7% now, according to the National Consumer Price Index. And for the central bank, setting monetary policy when there is low growth and rising inflation is a much more challenging task. You have to find a balance between price stability and not choking growth entirely.
Veerakorn said monetary policy tightening alone will not help to contain inflation.
Monetary tightening to contain inflation needs a more careful look to see what is actually driving inflation today. It is not just demand pull inflation, there is also supply push inflation at work in view of the tax increases that are now working its way through to price increases, as well as the supply side shock that has come through the agriculture sector. If you look at the breakdown of food and non-food inflation, it's very clear that food inflation is rising rapidly and much faster than non-food inflation. So monetary tightening alone to contain inflationary pressures is not the answer. We have to also look at the supply side factors that are impacting price increases, particularly in food prices.
Welcome back to the program. A recovering global economy, the dynamics of China and India in future economic growth. This will be the topic of discussion on the 31st of this month at the Lakshman Kadirgama Institute. To talk about this and more, we are joined by Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, who will be making the presentation. Dr. Vignaraja, thank you very much for coming on the show to speak about this very timely topic. Sino-Lankan relations have been a very hot topic even in the political sphere at present. We've seen protests in Hambantota against Chinese investment there, even against Indian investment or against any foreign investment, it would seem. What do you make of current Sri Lankan relations with China?
Well, historically we've had very good relations with China. The BMICH in the 1970s is a prominent monument to that relationship, and then the Nelum Pokana in 2011 is another example of that. However, our trade and investment relations with China are still at a very early stage. Exports from China account for some 6% of Sri Lanka's exports. foreign direct investment from China into Sri Lanka are only 6% of total foreign direct investment. So I think we need to do a lot more on the economic front to build on this strong and warm foreign policy and political relationship that we've had over decades.
There are reports that China's growth rate is moderating in spite of the IMF predicting a global sort of upswing in economic growth this year. What are the factors that are behind this slowdown for China?
So China was one of the world's fastest growing economies for several decades. And since the global financial crisis, its growth rate has slowed considerably. The IMF number for 2017 is 6.8%. And that's only slightly different to the number the previous year. And in 2018, we expect 6.5% according to the IMF. I guess there are several factors behind China's growth moderation. The first is that industrial countries have been in recession after the global financial crisis, which have meant less demand for the exports that China makes. A second factor is China itself is rebalancing its economy away from investment in exports to domestic demand in services. And we are seeing that very much in the form of rising wages due to a tightening labor market and less investment in manufacturing due to high levels of corporate debt in China. And then there is potentially protectionism that is now pervading the international economy, which also adds to worries and concerns of investors in China and other economies.
Do you feel that the Chinese will take any policy measures or any drastic steps to sort of address this slowdown in growth?
So I don't expect a hard landing in China, meaning a sharp slowdown in the growth rate that they have achieved. As countries typically get richer, like China over time, they find slower growth. The kinds of measures that China is undertaking come in three forms. The first is they're trying to do gradual structural reforms. So they're trying to move in their state-owned enterprises towards a more mixed strategy, with also commercialization of some of those state-owned enterprises in a gradual sense, plus joint ventures with other private companies. Secondly, they are trying to do financial sector restructuring to deepen the capital market and to allow the entry of foreign and private companies more into the banking sector. Another aspect of that is the One Belt, One Road program that is trying to build infrastructure, road, rail, sea, across Asia and the Pacific right through to Europe. And that is really using China's surpluses, both on the balance of payments as well as its large reserves, to try to create this vast web of infrastructure and also to stimulate Chinese growth and outward investment. And third, China is engaging in trying to reduce barriers to trade through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, this mega regional trade agreement that links the ASEAN countries, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. So there are a number of steps they're doing, but they're kind of coming on board gradually.
Dr. Vignarajah, can I ask you, there's a lot of speculation that manufacturing will shift out of China and into Asian countries, and that Sri Lanka will also be able to benefit from this. Is there any merit to this speculation? Does that potential still exist?
So outward investment in China has increased dramatically in the last few years due to this rebalancing of the Chinese economy, and that type of investment is in several forms. The first is its labor-intensive investment that is going into the ASEAN countries and India. So Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand in particular, and Vietnam are benefiting from this type of investment. And so what you're getting is the auto parts industry partly moving, electronics, as well as textiles and leather goods. In the case of Sri Lanka, we are not yet a major recipient of Chinese inward investment into our manufacturing sector. And we could be a potential partner in the future, given our very strategic location in the Indian Ocean and given our proximity to the Indian market. So one would have thought that Chinese firms eventually would want to come to Sri Lanka to invest, to round trip also into India, on the assumption that we also have a trade agreement with India. So I think the potential is there.
Given the sort of slowdown in Chinese growth, how realistic should we be when it comes to the proposed free trade agreement with China that is in the pipeline, and also the large amounts of foreign FDI that's coming in from China in terms of the Hambantota port, etc.?
So the trade agreement with China, I think, is a necessary condition for better economic relations. It will provide for rules-based trade and investment between China and Sri Lanka, and open up markets and provide confidence for two-way trade. That's critical. However, we have to do this agreement with very open eyes. We must ensure that we have a trade adjustment bill which allows for losing sectors in Sri Lanka to move into more productive areas in the future, for retraining of workers. Second, we have to ensure that the BOI and the EDB have greater promotion budgets so they can promote outward investment from Sri Lanka and exports from Sri Lanka into China. It's a very difficult market to penetrate, and Chinese language is an issue, and certainly also its business practices, very different to us. So we have to put in the promotional resources. Third, we would want to make sure that we finance our small and medium enterprises properly. SME finance is a big issue, and those companies also should benefit from this opening up to China by linking into value chains and indeed eventually direct exporting. And finance has been a traditional problem. The banks in Sri Lanka have been fairly conservative. Interest rates are very high, not due to the bank's own fault per se, but due to also issues in the macroeconomy. So these measures are really necessary to accompany the free trade agreement with China. And in the agreement, we should ask for everything but arms, as it were, non-reciprocal market access with long adjustment periods. And I think China will give it to us, because the agreement is not really about the economics for China. It's a political agreement with a friendly country that they have had great relations for a long time and now have big port infrastructure.
All right, we'll talk about China's relationship with smaller nations right after this short commercial break. Welcome back to the program. We're in conversation with Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, one of the country's foremost experts on Sino-Lankan relations. Dr. Vignaraja, when we left off, we were talking about China's relationships with smaller Asian countries. And there's one particular relationship that comes to mind, the sort of horror story of Chinese investment, of Chinese influence, if you will, and that is Laos. I watched a documentary recently detailing, which went into great detail on Chinese investment in Laos, specifically with the Golden City, unplanned rapid development, the adoption of special laws for these so-called export and trade zones. And I noticed that these are many of the fears that are being echoed over here in Sri Lanka as well, by farmers, fisher folk, etc., in Hambantota, by blue collar workers, etc. What can Sri Lanka do to ensure that we don't become that our relationship with China is not like the Laotian relationship with China?
So there's a big difference between Sri Lanka and Laos. Laos is a landlocked country and not really on a fundamental trade route. And that is the big difference. Sri Lanka is in the middle of the Indian Ocean and a sea-bound country. So our potential is much greater than Laos. And we sit right at the hub of India in the value chain context that China is outwardly investing into. Now, the concern that you raised about the Laotian case is certainly one that we should draw lessons on. And there are several ways we might attempt to overcome such potential difficulties. The first is the free trade zone that should accompany the Hambantota port development is much talked about, and will really provide, if you like, the icing on the cake of such a development of a port. And that should have factories in it that have good local linkages with the domestic economy. So one would ideally want them to be purchasing goods and services from the Sri Lankan economy to help develop small and medium enterprises that are capable of supplying quality services to the Chinese firms in that factory and also their zone. Second, we would want these firms to employ local workers, which would be another important aspect of this. And third, we'd want to ensure that the legislation allowed for entrance from other countries as well as Sri Lanka into those zones. So those will be important conditions. Now on the Sri Lankan side, there are also issues we've got to tackle. The first and foremost is we have to have small and medium enterprises that are price, quality, delivery ready to service those Chinese companies. The view I have is that our SMEs typically are very weak and perform well below world standards in many industries. So we have to make a major effort to get them up to those standards, and finance is a critical element, technology and other aspects are another. The second relates to the workers. The workers that we have are different to the Chinese workers. And the difference is this. In China, the worker will work 7 days a week, 3 shifts if needed. Okay? The Sri Lankan worker loves holidays. The Sri Lankan worker likes taking long breaks. Productivity is a challenge here. So we have to consider this issue very seriously, and it means a lot of education and training. It means skill upgrading of our workers. And these are caricatures that I talk about, but we have to take these things seriously if we are going to be EPZ ready to work with Chinese factories on the scale and the size they're expecting.
Sri Lanka is pinning most of its sort of development hopes on a great deal of investment coming from China. This is a two-part question, can we actually expect that great deal of investment, that sort of sustainable development finance to continue to flow in from China? And should we be taking on everything that China offers, given that it might antagonize our very powerful neighbor to the north?
So the investment side, I think the potential is there. China only accounts for some 6% of inward investment into Sri Lanka. And that number should be much higher, given the potential that we have, and I expect that number will grow over time. In terms of the types of investment we get, we would like to move away from infrastructure to manufacturing and indeed some of the services sectors. And I think we have to have a good investment climate for that. You know, Sri Lanka is now 110th on the World Bank's investment climate survey out of 160 odd countries. Our legal system is challenging. We don't solve cases fast enough in the courts. We have problems with terminating of workers, according to the World Bank. It takes some time to set up a business here. Getting electricity and other connections is a problem. We need to deal with the investment climate, and I think government is trying to resolve some issues there. A second aspect of that concerns the training of our workers. I think we have to dramatically upskill and upgrade our workers' skills if we want to provide the kind of skill boost that China wants. And third, we have to ensure that our small and medium enterprises are linked to Chinese companies that are functioning in that zone. Now, in the context of India and the port, there is concern indeed in the Indian media, in particular, that this port and other facilities will be used to further Chinese military interests in South Asia and in Sri Lanka. I understand that the agreement is supposed to allow the Sri Lankan Navy to regulate the visits of foreign navies into Hambantota port. So that is a good thing from the Sri Lankan point of view, and we have quite a strong navy and a very scrupulous navy. A second aspect of that is Sri Lanka is engaging in multilateral dialogue with regional powers, including China, the United States, India and others, to ensure that there is trust building that occurs amongst naval powers. The Galle dialogue held just yesterday is a classic example of such a dialogue. If people meet and talk, they hopefully solve some of the issues. Sri Lanka is also collaborating in some of the naval exercises with friendly powers, including China and India, as well as engage in some anti-piracy issues in this ocean and further beyond. So I hope that those military issues don't impede the great economic potential we can get from a strong China-Sri Lanka economic relationship.
Just a couple of questions before we wrap up. We spoke about the 2 free trade agreements that are in the pipeline, ETCA, which is likely to be signed this year, and also the free trade agreement with China. Which of these 2 should the government be prioritizing, if they should be prioritizing one, and what should Sri Lanka be cautious of in these trade negotiations?
So my own view is we have very limited trade negotiating skills. This is done on a rather sort of ad hoc basis with a few people in different ministries. And so you have to prioritize. And to prioritize, I think I would go for the Chinese agreement, because I think that is a political decision on the part of China. They already have large investments here, and having a rules-based trade agreement which would help their investment as well is really a no-brainer for China. So we shouldn't approach it as a trade negotiation. It's more a political discussion of give and take with a small country between a large country. Then if the Chinese give us a good agreement, we'll have something to take to the Indians and say we have an agreement with China, and my expectation is that an agreement with India will come very fast because we would have one with China. So if I were a betting person, I would want to invest in the agreement with China first. That is to not neglect the discussions with India. I think we must definitely understand better what their wishes and aspirations are for trade investment with India, but that would be my sort of strategic advice.
So what you're saying is that agreement with China, having an agreement with China already on the table will give us greater bargaining power when it comes to an agreement with India.
Yes, and indeed that is typically the case of small countries with limited negotiating capacity. You try to prioritize where you do agreements. Trying to do too many free trade agreements all at once with a very small team, I think sadly may be beyond our reach and could end in tears if we are unlucky.
Dr. Vignarajah, thank you very much again for coming on the show. It's been a most illuminating conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So some key takeaways from our conversation with Dr. Vignarajah: when you're dealing with giants, tread lightly, tread cautiously, but also be open to the world. I'm Nadim Majid. This is Biz First Review 360. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Until then, good night and good luck.